before delving in, I would kind of like to know, what is it that you're really interested in getting from me in terms of information? I'm going to give a disclosure at the beginning. I am not for open courtrooms for dependency and delinquency for a number of reasons. Some of my colleagues feel differently in terms of just having blanket open courtrooms, and I'll share with you my reasons why, but keep in mind that I am probably about 40 to 50% of the bench at this time. In Southern California, there's a swell to consider opening courtrooms, and there's a hot debate going on about that. And as journalist, I was very excited when I met with Daniel, and he began talking about the ethical protocol that he was working on for journalists who may go into the juvenile court. And that's really where it begins and ends, is the ethical boundaries that you would have as a journalist, and if you're married to the outcome. Those of you who probably aren't married to the outcome, those ethical boundaries become a little gray. But those who are really concerned about shaping their next door neighbor may feel a little differently, because surprisingly, the juvenile justice system touches every single one of us. And for those reasons, I have real concerns about opening courtrooms without there being some reflection, some ethical boundaries, and notice for the parties who are being impacted by the revelation of their lives. Because what a lot of people don't realize in the adult court, it's just the individual that you're dealing with and their conduct. You're not dealing with their parents and their siblings and the like. I was a foster kid, and many people have asked me to tell my story. I had to really think about the impact it was going to have on my adult siblings, my parents, my cousins, all of the people in my family who might think, wow, what is that going to mean for me? Is that going to mean that I'm going to be examined because of a decision that was made in our family? So it has broad impact, and it has lasting impact with the internet, because everything's now a permanent carbon footprint. So with that.
Well, I just have a quick, you mentioned this because, your background in the system, and I didn't, that's for you to divulge whenever and however you want. Mm-hmm. But, I think there's something that clearly as a journalist I've run into is I've chronicled the lives of many youth, whether it was we came to each other because I was working very closely with SOCM, who you named as a commissioner to the juvenile courts in Alameda. And of course, SOCM, you could argue it has been to his benefit, the coverage that's out there, or Lily Dorman Colby, or a number of foster youth that have appeared, or former foster youth that have appeared in stories. But regardless, there is that disclosure, and I'm just wondering how long are the ramifications of those disclosures, and how hard is it for a young person to really, whether a teen or younger, to kind of foresee how that plays out later?
Collateral consequences. Yeah. It depends on where they are in the system and how deeply entrenched they are in the juvenile justice system, how impacted they are. If they are a young person who had somewhat of a stable placement, perhaps one, maybe two families of movement, and not really deeply entrenched, meaning that they didn't have any violence in their background, they didn't have mental health issues, there weren't an incarcerated parent that didn't have any impact on the abuse but was absent, who then gets pulled into the morass. It just depends, because each child's situation is a little different. I think what makes it somewhat curious is that we have young people who have a number of tentacles outside of the juvenile justice system. They're impacted in the education system, the mental health system, as well as other tentacles with substance abuse or immigration issues, which is really delicate if they have undocumented parents. So there's so many layers depending on how many other outside systems that also have their own confidentiality, FERPA for the educational rights, HIPAA for medical and psychological rights, and having the privacy of those records. And so I often tell young people who come to me, when you're ready to take charge of your story, as opposed to having a social worker tell your story or having someone who has a snippet of your social history be the narrator of your life, then you're ready to have your story told by a journalist. Because once you've kind of dealt with the trauma and are able to articulate it in a healthy way, I think then those stories have power. There are some young people, and there's a gentleman who I have in mind right now who has transcended being in the California Youth Authority, has a great career now, has a child, has a wife that graduated from here, and he now wants to transition and become a lawyer, but because of his juvenile transgressions, he cannot pass the moral turpitude test. He's pretty certain of that. And just even getting into a law school is going to be challenging because his story was told on Oprah. It was a chapter in a book that's well known. And so his story precedes him before he even walks in the door. And it was one that was embedded in a lot of violence. And so that's why I said it depends on how deep the young person is in the system and how many tentacles they have outside, whether they're a dependency child that then crossed over into delinquency, because now you have two